Right, hello everyone. What I want to do in this next 30 minutes is really to introduce you to what an environmental scientist does. And I suppose the big thing to say first is that the difference between environmental science and most of the other sort of science courses that we're talking about downstairs is that it's a field science. Now, a lot of people like working in labs. I'm not one of them. They tend to be rather grey things. We have to wear ridiculous clothing. And by the end of the day, you're looking at the clock. So an environmental scientist is a bit different from that. So we tend to be happy. We tend to work outside. We have great accommodation. Then we have brilliant labs. And our lecture theatres are massive. And not only that, but also we secure quite a lot of cash. And these statistics are actually from the Which University report that was published last year. And it's amazing, really. And what it is, it's the top 3 subjects that receive the highest salaries after 8 months of student graduation. And the first one, no surprise, is medicine at about $39,000 a year. Very nice. Second one is dentistry. And the third one is plant and environmental science, which is about $35,000. And that is a reflection of the importance of this subject area and also of almost the world shortage in field scientists that can actually identify species and do environmental impact assessments. So what I'm going to talk about really in these next 30 minutes is just one aspect of the work of an environmental scientist. And in the course, what we concentrate on are the major sort of global issues. So the first major global issue will be global warming, then food security, biodiversity loss, pollution, and energy security. But the subject I want to really just concentrate on is global warming, and in particular, looking at the greenhouse gases and monitoring these greenhouse gases from agriculture. And if we look at the burps and the bubbles, so to speak, then we're looking at methane, we're looking at carbon dioxide, and the one that's particularly interesting to me is we're looking at laughing gas or nitrous oxide. And all of these 3 are from agriculture. If we look at their relative importance in forcing the climate, we always go on about carbon dioxide. Actually, carbon dioxide is pretty poor on a molecule-per-molecule basis at changing the Earth's temperature. It's just that there are such high concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If we look at laughing gas, if we look at nitrous oxide, then that's 310 times greater than carbon dioxide in forcing the climate. And the one that we're particularly concerned with in Ireland is methane, and that's about 21 times greater than CO2 in warming the planet, should we say. Okay, so where do these gases come from, and how can we measure them? Well, the reason it's important is because Ireland is a signatory country to the Kyoto Protocol, and that was a global agreement, an attempt at reducing the greenhouse gases. And in Europe, the target was about an 8% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And Ireland was, in fact, allowed to increase its emissions by about 13%, compared with a baseline of about 1990. And the problem is, what you ask for is what you get, and we went a bit crazy. So this is our base, this is the target which we were supposed to hit, and we can see that we went mad here, massive increase in carbon dioxide equivalents, and then we start to peter down after about 2008. We've only just reached this Kyoto limit threshold value, really not because of any strong legislation, but because of the decline in the economic climate. So we're looking really at reductions in the size of the beef and dairy herds, which have accounted for, in the main, this decrease in carbon dioxide equivalents. And Ireland is peculiar compared with all of the other countries in Europe. with regards to the fact that agriculture makes up about 30% of the total greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. The European average is 9%, but Ireland, because of its land mass being dominated by grasslands and its agriculture being dominated by dairy and beef, agriculture accounts for 30% of CO2 emissions, or CO2 equivalent emissions. Where do these gases come from? Well, the first sort of mistake, really, is that most people think that cows fart methane. They do fart methane, but they burp more methane than they fart. So, in fact, when we're measuring methane from cattle, then thank God we deal with the front end and we don't deal with the back end. With regards to carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, then carbon dioxide, one of the major pools of carbon dioxide will be the soil carbon and the respiration of that soil carbon into the atmosphere. And so we can say about sources of CO2, we talk about autotrophic and heterotrophic respiration. And we're really just talking about soil respiration in the main there as our main source of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere in agriculture. If we look at laughing gas, nitrous oxide, then that arises from various microbes that utilize reactive nitrogen in the soil as a source of energy. But with regards to agriculture, then the two most important greenhouse gases which we attempt to measure are methane and nitrous oxide. These are, as I've said in this slide here, the major problematic greenhouse gases from agriculture. As I say, methane is about 21 times greater than carbon dioxide at warming the climate, and nitrous oxide is approaching 300 times greater than CO2. We have to report back to the EU and the UN with regards to the concentrations of greenhouse gases that we emit into the atmosphere. And it's amazing just to explain to people actually how we do that, because the ideal situation will be to have lots of scientists employed all across Ireland at various measuring stations taking real-time measurements of these greenhouse gases. But in the past, the reality, in fact, is quite different. In the past, what we have is a few people in an office actually calculating a very simple sum whereby 1% of the total amount of fertilizer that is added to agricultural soils is given off as nitrous oxide. And we call this an emission factor. So, in fact, there's a tremendous amount of error associated with the reporting procedure of greenhouse gases, according to this Kyoto Protocol. And it's really the job of the environmental scientists now to improve this procedure, to actually measure real-time fluxes of these greenhouse gases. And the reason that they are so useful is that we can start to construct carbon flux diagrams for various agricultural ecosystems. And we can start to think about different changes in management that will make, for instance, in this case, soils in a grazed paddock system store more carbon from the atmosphere. So, in fact, we can look at management options that allow a greater storage of atmospheric CO2 in the form of organic carbon in the form of soil. And in this case, this is taken from a paper that was published in 2003. For this particular grazed grassland, then this is what's called a sink for carbon. And in this particular year, it stored about approximately 2 tons of carbon per hectare per year in the soil. But these are not easy sort of calculations to do because you have to measure the various pools of carbon and you have to measure the various fluxes of carbon. And that's where environmental scientists actually come in. We can also look at the nitrogen cycle. And in fact, it was published in 2011 the results of a very major European environmental study. And it's the European Nitrogen Assessment. And basically it's an attempt to construct a nitrogen cycle for the whole of Europe. And here we see 200 experts from 21 countries, and they were specifically looking at the impacts and costs of nitrogen pollution in Europe. Now, some of the findings are fascinating, and again, they focus on agriculture as being a prime source of pollution. Not in this case atmospheric pollution per se, but now in reactive nitrogen. And Europe, in fact, imports nitrogen in the form of plant protein. And we import about 12 million tons a year of plant protein. And surprisingly, only 15% of that is actually used to feed people directly. And 85% goes to feed beef and dairy cattle. And of course, associated with that will be nitrogen pollution. And that will contribute to air pollution. It will fuel climate change. And from this, this massive study, this European assessment of nitrogen pollution in Europe, then it was calculated that annually nitrogen pollution from agriculture would cost each person in Europe about 740 euros. Again, these measurements are made by scientists in the field, taking direct real-time measures of leached nitrogen, of nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. Okay, so let's look at the problems of measuring these gases. And the most exciting one to measure is methane. And in fact, here we have cattle with a yoke that is attached. And in fact, this is a vacuum tube here. You pump the air out of this tube. And we've got a harness. We've actually got a pipe that is attached just in front of the cattle's nose. So if we look in this slide here. And what we do is we then release the vacuum. And of course, that will suck in air. And over a 12-hour period, it will record the amount of methane that the cattle belches out. Now, that's not as easy as I've just explained. When these experiments were first carried out, as soon as you put the harness on the cattle, they'd run around the field and then they'd just scrape it off on the nearest tree. So the next year these experiments were done, we had hand-reared cattle. And here we see a collection of very friendly hand-reared cattle before they have their harnesses fixed. Now, experimentally, these studies will be so simple if we could all work on this wonderful little cow here, who's called Swallow. And Swallow was, up until recently, the smallest cow in the world. And in fact, it's a Dexter cow from North Yorkshire. Now, amazingly, that cow is 85 centimetres tall. Now, that is smaller than the world's biggest rabbit. And if you don't believe me, I've got a photograph of the world's biggest rabbit. And here we are. This is Darius. And he weighs 22 kilos and is 1.2 meters tall. In fact, if we all swapped over to eating rabbits, then we would actually decrease the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted into the atmosphere. What about measuring soil respiration? Well, that's a little less exciting. What we have is a piece of equipment that actually measures the absorption of infrared radiation by carbon dioxide. So it utilizes the fact that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It requires, well, the repetitive measurements. And this is one of the truths besides field measurement, is that you get to work outside, but to be careful in your collection of data, then obviously you make an extreme repetitive, careful measurements. This is one of my old PhD students here, Suresh from India. He wasn't too impressed with the Irish climate, but we treat our students very softly, so we provided them with a waterproof jacket, which wasn't enough, and if you look closely, we also had to provide him with an umbrella. And that's really just to underline another reality about working in the field, that is, not always is the weather so friendly. In fact, it can be wet, it can be freezing cold, but most of all, it can be fun. So, the way that soil respiration is measured in the main, either by automatic chambers or manual chambers, is we remove the above ground vegetation and we place over that a chamber which then records the linear accumulation of carbon dioxide by looking at the absorption of infrared radiation by this gas. So we can calculate quite easily, therefore, the rate of soil respiration, the rate of emission of carbon dioxide from the soil surface. If we look at measurements of nitrous oxide, then the cheapest way that we can achieve this is to use large chambers which we place on the soil, and we allow the nitrous oxide to accumulate, and we remove samples every so often, and we measure the concentration of gas in these samples using a process which is called gas chromatography. And here we've got a field scattered with chambers where we're looking at the different rates of nitrous oxide emissions from spring barley. In fact, we've used lots and lots of these different chamber techniques. We've looked at bioenergy crops, we've looked at grazed grasslands. And what you do is you calculate the linear accumulation of time, and therefore you can upscale that to meter squared and to emissions based per hectare. But the interesting and most expensive equipment that we can use actually measures real-time photosynthesis, not using chambers, but actually measuring eddies, bubbles, so to speak, of carbon dioxide that percolate up from the soil surface. And it's so accurate that, in fact, we can look at the diurnal switching of photosynthesis and soil respiration. And here's the equipment here. It's about 100,000 just for one piece of equipment. But on this graph here, whatever is above is actual net emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And what is below is the uptake of carbon dioxide into the plant. So we're looking at daily rates of photosynthesis, and then in the night we're looking at respiration. And it's so sensitive that, as we expect, when we take a silage cut, then in fact we knock out photosynthesis, obviously, because we've got rid of the vegetation, but root respiration and soil respiration is still continuing. And then, of course, as the crop regrows, we can start to pick up our photosynthesis. And these measurements that are taken not only over a week, months, yearly, are so important, because what we can do is divide up our data sets into months, and we can determine if in any one month the net sum was either a storage of carbon, in other words, uptake of carbon into the soil, or a net source of carbon. So we have a way of looking at the gross flux of carbon in and out of an ecosystem. And we call this an eddy covariance technique. Okay, so the ideal situation, therefore, would be for all of this equipment to be distributed across Ireland at various important examples of, say, grasslands, energy crops, cereal crops, and different soils and in different climate areas of Ireland. But of course, the limiting factor there is cost and manpower. And what is happening now is a shift away from collecting data to actually using the data that has already been collected to construct computer simulation models. So we can develop, as environmental scientists, mechanistic models that explain the biochemistry, the soil chemistry, so to speak, of nitrous oxide emissions and carbon dioxide. What we're looking at, therefore, is a means of assessing greenhouse gas emissions from the whole of Ireland using computer simulation models. So now we've got an example of environmental scientists actually working in the lab, being mathematicians. And in fact, quite a lot of our recent research grants are focused entirely not on collecting data, but on modelling the data that's already been collected. This slide here, for instance, just looks at a very simple model for soil respiration, where we have different components of soil respiration. We've got the rhizosphere, we've got above-ground microbial respiration, and we've got below-ground microbial respiration. And all of these components here receive different substrates to drive that respiration, and collectively, they will produce a flux of CO2 into the atmosphere, and that will be governed by various environmental factors, such as temperature, water, or nutrient availability. So using this sort of simple conceptual model, you can come up with rather difficult field experiments to test that model and come up with actual values. Here we've got values of total soil respiration. This, in fact, is respiration of plant roots, and this is the respiration, the heterotrophic, the microbial respiration in the soil. So, in fact, in this model, soil respiration is dominated by both plant root respiration and the microbes in the soil. And using this sort of data, we can construct models, and in this next slide here, the dark circles, they represent actual measured fluxes of CO2 from the soil, and the red circles, they represent modelled fluxes of CO2. So we can see in this case, we've got a very good fit between our measured and computer simulated, our modelled CO2 fluxes. So we can test the model with field data, and then we can start to ask specific questions of the model, such as what is going to happen as climate changes, as Ireland gets warmer, with regards to the flux of CO2 into the atmosphere. And of course, one of the things we're really worried about is as the Earth gets warmer, this tremendous reservoir of carbon that is in the Earth's soils is going to start to be respired quicker. And that's going to feed more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and we're going to get a feed-forward control. So we can use these computer simulation models to ask specific questions. You can either develop your own models, as was in the last slide there, or you can be rather lazy and you can just pick one up ready available off the shelf. And in fact, one of the most famous ones that account for nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide is a model that is called DNDC. And lots of environmental scientists across the globe are using this model with their own sort of sets of field-collected data to verify that the model is producing a good fit. and then to use that model again, as I've given the example of the soil respiration model, to ask specific questions. Now, just to see how wonderful these sort of off-the-shelf models can be, then I've got this graph here. Now, I don't want you to be too concerned, but if we just look at the end point of this graph here, this is days in the year, and this is the cumulative flux of nitrous oxide. And the closed symbols represent measured fluxes of nitrous oxide, and the open symbols represent our computer simulation, our calculated flux from the computer model. And we can see that in both of these graphs here, we get a very good agreement between our computer simulated flux and our modeled flux. So the point I'm trying to make is that environmental scientists not only can work in the field and collect this data, but you can be an environmental scientist and never get outside at all and work in the lab and work just in front of a computer and create these models and ask very important questions that can be solved by these computer simulation models. And in fact, here we see one specific question being asked, and that is what happens to nitrous oxide flux from the soil when we increase the Earth's temperature? And we can see that there are 3 peaks in nitrous oxide across the year. We've got 1 peak associated with the end of winter and the early spring, and that's really associated with rainfall. Then we've got a 2nd peak associated with the addition of fertilizer, and then we've got a 3rd peak that's associated with the breakdown of plant residues. But if you can see, these open symbols here are giving us larger flux than the closed symbols, and these open symbols are reflecting an increase in global temperature. Okay, that's all I really want to talk about with regards to environmental science. If you want to find more about the course, then we have a stand downstairs. But just to say that environmental science is, well, along with zoology, it's one of the most popular of the science courses that we offer. At present, zoology takes about 31 students, and environmental science takes 27 students. And we're in the School of Natural Sciences. And of course, there are other subjects that are field-based as well, notably geography, geology, plant sciences. So, when you've got time, and if you want to find out about environmental science in more detail, then feel free and talk to me downstairs. But thank you for your interest, and I'll see you later.